Hi, so I'm here today with Edwin Bryant, professor at Rutgers University, having spent time at Harvard, the Department of Hinduism there, author of many books, one of which the popular translation commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and he teaches workshops internationally and worldwide, maintaining a committed yoga practice in the Vaishnite tradition of Bhakti Yoga. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, Rutgers is the State University of New Jersey.
New Jersey, right.
Yes. Yeah. But I'm originally British.
Yes.
So I'm a Brit. I'm a Brit caught on the wrong side of the pond, perhaps.
Yes. We could definitely hear that. Edwin, can you just give us a little bit of your background about how you got into studying the philosophy of yoga?
Well, I've always been intrigued by Indian philosophy, and from a very young age, even before I really knew anything about India or even philosophy. So I was one of those characters that hitchhiked over to India in the late 70s and did the Overland Trail before that all closed down. And I spent a number of years living in India. Pretty much went native and entered just deeply into the culture, into the practices, and the sacred texts. So that's how it began. And then Where was I living? I was traveling around, but my base was in Vrindavan, which was a place sacred to Lord Krishna. Mm-hmm. And I lived in an ashram for a number of years, but then became a little sort of disenfranchised because, ashrams are material places. And so there are politics and power struggles and the usual thing that one hopes to avoid when one goes to an ashram. So at a certain point, I no longer found my place in the ashram, and I decided I wanted to have autonomy and a source of a place where I could continue my studies and my practices, a source, a place for security, and so I actually wasn't originally planning to go into become an academic. My initial game plan when I left India was to teach English as a foreign language in the Middle East. I was going to do 3 months in Bahrain and these places, and then live in India. Have some income to live in India for the other 9 months.
Well, I mean, what was your kind of a background like? Well, what did you study? Did you study academically? Like, did you do a degree or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I grew up. My dad was in the Foreign Office, so I always had this sort of sense of the British Foreign Office.
Smart by background.
Yeah, we never had a home, and we were always go exotic countries. I was, going to these places and getting off a plane in some amazing place was something I grew into. So it wasn't sort of it was a natural thing for me to do, to go to India or the Middle East, all of these places. But I did 1 year in Manchester University. I don't know, 76 perhaps. And but I wasn't at that point interested already to study. I was just sort of treading water, and then I did it just to keep a promise to my dad. He said, look, if you want to go to India, but if you want my paternal blessings, just at least do 1 year in university. And I
that was all he asked. It was just 1 year.
Obviously, he was hoping that I would 1 year and I would say.
Okay, yeah.
It was skillful means, but it didn't quite work.
It didn't work out. Yeah. Well, that's incredible, though. I mean, you don't mind asking then, how do you get the lucidity of style that you have for your translation of the Sutras of Patanjali is how I came to know. You're probably I think also maybe the movie Yoga Unveiled or something like that you're in.
No, just a 2-minute clip in that. Yeah, I had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, exactly. But I think I saw you there. But it was really reading your sutras. And I've read a lot of the Sutras of Patanjali by different people, and your clarity there is formidable. I mean, as a fellow writer or a rubbish one at that, how did you get to that level of clarity with it? Is it by personal practice, or did you practice stylistically, or?
Personal practice of sadhana, the Indian tradition. The Indian tradition, it is not just intellectuality for the sake of intellectuality. Clarity comes from sattva, and sattva is something that is cultivated and with lifestyle and sadhana practices. So therefore, the svadhyaya, the study of sacred texts, is accompanied with also processes to make the mind able to have deep insights about those texts. So practice and study go hand in hand. And of course, I lived in India for many years, so I studied the languages. And then, of course, if we want to go deep into the text, and obviously you have to know, one would be well advised to learn languages. And finally, that's all I do. I don't do anything. I don't have a television. I don't have much of a social life. So this is my social life. I consider the time I spend with great minds like Patanjali and Sri Krishna to be my social life. So so thank you for the compliment, but I don't feel there's anything special about me. I think the texts themselves, and I think the practices create the conditions for viveka, for insight.
So all I need to do is practice more yoga, and my style will become less impenetrable. As a kind of academic philosopher, or rather a wayward one, I have a surgeon style I try and wade through.
Well, I remember actually one of my Sanskrit teachers in university, who was an academic, not a practitioner. She was a bit of a practitioner, but she said something that stayed with me. She said, if you really want to communicate to people, you'll find a way of communicating to people.
Right.
Whereas if we're trapped up in our own cleverness and erudition, or we simply want to make a good show in a conference with a small group of colleagues, and if we have that kind of a hankara or ego, then our language will be impenetrable for most people.
That's really nice.
So I think there's intention and just desire to serve is also one other factor amongst the others that we mentioned.
Yeah, nice. What is your practice of yoga that you mentioned, the viveka and the clarity and the sadhana? Can you say what? I mean, I know you do hatha yoga, don't you, in the Iyengar tradition?
I do hatha yoga in the Iyengar tradition, but I don't consider it my primary sadhana. I think of it sattvasizes. Clearly, it has a wonderful sattvasizing effect, and also it keeps my body in decent enough shape that I'm not terribly uncomfortable in it. But my own practice is I come in the Vrindavan, Krishna, the Vraj is the name for Vrindavan. Vrindavan is a place in northwest India where Lord Krishna spent his childhood pastimes. So the Krishna of devotion, the center in India, the sacred center of the Krishna of devotion, not the Krishna of the Gita or the Krishna of the Mahabharata, but the Krishna of devotion, which is baby Krishna, young Krishna. Right. That locus is Vrindavan. So I belong to a lineage that comes out of that tradition, and the sadhanas that are primary in that tradition are japa, which is a chitta-vritti nirodha. It is a Patanjalian practice, but which Patanjali also prioritizes in the form of Om, the japa tadartha bhavanam, right? Tasya vachakaha pranavaha. You know that this is the sound not representation, but sound manifestation of Ishvara. So my tradition takes the Om and that Om is just a seed, and seeds produce fruits and trees and much more embellished things. So the Krishna tradition then takes the Om, and for them the Krishna mantra becomes a more sort of fully manifest. It's Ishvara with form and qualities represented in this sort of rather larger mantra. So that's the mantra I chant. It's the Hare Krishna mantra and japa. And then in addition to that, I do puja every morning to Sri Krishna. And then my whole life is spent teaching, which is my Bhakti Yoga, which is my offering to Bhagavan. So I try to structure my whole way of life. Can you just
clarify to my readers about the baby Krishna? It's not a different incarnation of the Krishnas, is it? Or just a different kind of face of the life of Krishna? And just maybe a lot of people aren't kind of aware of the difference of the kind of qualities of the different Krishnas, let's say.
Well, when Krishna says in the Gita that, if you read chapter 4, when he announces that he's Bhagavan, he's God, and then he says, I descend in the world, dharma samstapanartaya, to establish dharma. And so that's the sort of Gita of that's the Krishna of the adult Krishna. In a sort of, performing dharma, God coming down to dharma samstapana, to establish dharma, and so that's the sort of formal Krishna, but that's not the Krishna of devotion. I think there's only one temple in India of actual Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita Krishna. That's not the object of adoration. The object of adoration in the Krishna tradition is baby Krishna or young Krishna, Gopi Krishna, sort of up to his youthfulness. At that point, Krishna is not engaging in any dharma or, establishing righteousness. He's just exchanging love with his devotees. And so there we see loving, mischievous Krishna just engaging in all these mischievous pranks and loving exchanges, not for himself, obviously, because God is self-satisfied up to Rama, but for the pleasure of his devotees. And that is those stories are so delightful.
Right.
That it's those stories which are at the center of Krishna devotion and also at the center of Krishna worship. Krishna temples in India are Radha Krishna temple, which is Krishna with his consort Radha.
So, if we can, a lot of my listeners are hatha yoga practitioners. So, if we can kind of compare the qualities of devotion to the asanas somehow, are the different subtle shifts in the devoted attitude towards the Krishna? Say this is your practice of devotion, and the subtleties and the nuances of devoting to the young child of Krishna is like the skill of asanas in a way.
The skill of what?
Asanas, of yoga asanas, perfecting.
Asanas.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, asana in the classical tradition is simply something you do to your body so you prepare it so you can sit and meditate. It's not a practice unto himself. Guruji Iyengar has made that into a practice unto itself, and Krishnamacharya did, and that means Patabi Joyce and your tradition as well as Iyengar and so forth. They have taken asana itself as the prop for the mind. So it's interesting because Krishnamacharya is sort of balancing these two types of worlds. There's the world of asana where you fix your mind on the asana, you settle the vrittis in the pose, but he also has this whole other Vaishnava side. So did Guruji Iyengar, and it's quite fascinating. And Guruji Iyengar didn't share that very much.
No, at least it's Patabi Joyce.
But Patabi Joyce was coming from a different lineage. He's coming from the Advaita lineage, which is not quite as dualistically theistic, and therefore not quite as intensely theistic as the Vaishnava traditions. We'd probably need some time to sort of unpack that. But so the goal of bhakti is actually love of God. It's not the attainment of an experience of pure consciousness. That's there. That's sort of pick that up on the way, right. But it's not the actual grand finale goal. Whereas in the Yoga Sutra derived traditions, the Nirodha traditions, the goal is Sarupe Vastanam. It's an experience of pure consciousness.
So if I was going to question you on the love of God as to if you could qualify that any further as an experience, is it not pure consciousness? Is pure consciousness, and obviously you separated the two, love of God and pure consciousness, as different things. How would you qualify?
Well, love is a state of mind. So therefore, love isn't taking place. Consciousness is pervading the mind and therefore aware of the mind. So any kind of a relationship with God requires a mind and a body. It requires instrumentations, instruments of perception and experience. And so in the Prakritic world, we have our Prakritic mind and Prakritic body and Prakritic senses, and we use those to serve and think of God and love God and develop all those qualities. But in the post-mortem liberated state, in the Vaishnava traditions, we then get a different set of instruments made of Brahman, Saguna Brahman, like condensed Brahman. So the Atman is just pure conscious, like a battery. So therefore, if we put that together, then the Atman can either be in a Prakritic body, or it can either be in its Kaivalya, in its autonomous alone state, just in its own nature, or it can be in a divine body, which with mind and body, which it uses to have personal relationship with God. These are the sort of three. There's other options as well. Obviously, there are other options. There's Kashmir Shaivism. There's Shakta traditions, which Hatha Yoga is actually coming out of. But just briefly, love of God, to answer the question, is something which nothing goes on in consciousness. Consciousness has no in or out. It is just like light. It just is light, but it can illuminate things, coverings around it. So consciousness illuminates the mind, and love of God is taking place in the mind. So the bhaktas, the devotees, are not interested in just pure consciousness. They want to have that, and ultimately, why? Is because it's more blissful.
But isn't it always dualistic? I mean, in the kind of
yes,
with Patanjali, the always is the wish, or even a lot of the times in the Gita, the wish is to escape, escape samsara and suffering. But essentially, with this idea, wouldn't you want to stay in it to consistently appreciate this love of God?
You don't want to stay in it. While you're in it, you want to use your instrumentations to love God, but you want to get out of it. And then when you get out of it, you don't just want to. For the Vaishnavas, pure consciousness is just a halfway house, right? Once you become liberated, just experiencing your own consciousness is a halfway house. They want to go further into the divine realm of Brahman and receive a Brahman body, a body made of pure consciousness.
Okay.
So therefore, they want to get another body, a body which then it gets a bit, then it gets very interesting, the theology. What's the relationship with the divine body and the Atman? Somehow or other they merge.
The thing is, I think I kind of feel you're very unusual because you're a respected academic, but you also talk on a quite a different level that you don't usually hear in academia as a practitioner as well. I mean, my next question is the most intriguing one. Like, how do you reconcile the two worlds, and how do you find them different? And if so, how? That's sort of a broad question, I know.
Well, obviously, there is dharma for different situations. So everybody has multiple dharmas. So now you're doing your dharma as a talk show host. No doubt you have a dharma. You have a different dharma when you're with your parents. You have a different dharma when you're with your friends, and so on and so forth. So the dharma of colleague is I wear an academic hat. So if I go to conferences, I don't speak like this. So I then speak like an academic, and I don't anymore. I don't need to because it doesn't interest me. That I'm much more interested in my practice these days. But as a younger academic, yes, I would go to conferences and try to write papers but always on things that were related to my ultimate sort of theology. All my work was actually connected in some way to what I was deeply interested in. But you just articulate it in an academic fashion. Yes, so can you broach? Yes, you can broach both worlds, but I'm speaking to you because you're a yogi, so I'm using, just like I'm speaking to you in English, whereas if I was doing an interview in Italian, I would speak Italian. So I'm speaking to you more as a fellow yogi, but whereas in academia, one would speak. Now, in terms of the difference between an academic relationship with the material and a practitioner one, the practitioner sees these texts as sources of guidance and truth, guidance for one's spiritual journey. It's not so much concerned about whether they're historically real, about whether Krishna was he really born in 3000 BC? So therefore, it's the relationship is to get to experience the goals of yoga. In Bhakti, it's love, and in classical Patanjali, it's pure consciousness, or whatever that goal might be. But the academic approach, you're not interested in that at all. You're not, in fact, most academics don't believe in any of it. And so therefore, for them, it's all a human construct. And if it's a human construct, then they're interested in, well, who constructed it and why was it constructed and what are the power dynamics? And it's more of a Marxist Foucault type, engagement with the tradition. Who were the Brahmins? Why are they writing the stuff? What is their real agenda?
It seems strange to even kind of involve yourself in it if there's no real kind of wish to use the text, no?
I always find that something that I could never do, but there are intellectuals.
Right.
And they identify with the intellect, and they simply take pleasure in enjoying intellectuality for the sake of intellectuality. It's a type of hankara. It's a type of identity, and it's a type of way of being in the world.
But you must feel a bit separate from that.
I always felt a fish out of water, no question about that.
Yeah.
And I struggled with it, especially when I was younger. And I always felt like a closet yogi, and I always felt, frankly, kind of insecure, like I didn't really belong, and like I was going to get outed or busted. Because when I started, there were no practitioners in academia. Now there's a lot more. Yeah. And of course now I'm, tenured, and I'm 62. I do whatever I want now. I could even walk around with sacred clay. In fact, I probably will at some point, just to rock the boat a bit.
Yeah. What practice text do you refer to the most?
Well, my canonical text of my own practice is the Bhagavata Purana.
Right.
Is the central canonical text for the Vrindavan Krishna tradition. So I've translated the 10th book, and I've translated a sequel to Patanjali, by the way, and it's called Bhakti Yoga. It's a sequel. So, though that's my own personal kind of svadhyaya text. But in terms of the yoga community, I would say the canonical text ought to be, or are, the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita.
Do you think you need to know the text or the philosophy of it to practice yoga? I mean, whether it's Bhakti Yoga or Hatha Yoga, or something that ostensibly doesn't need philosophical knowledge.
No, the practice has its own potency and it has its own power, and it sattva-sizes the body, and it creates it favors. It works towards increasing the sattva component of the mind. So even if one has no philosophical relationship with the Indian moksha philosophical traditions, just doing, for example, asana or other types of practices, will make the mind sattvic. But one of the side effects, one of the qualities of sattva is interest in knowledge, is the sort of then the mind starts to become more inquisitive. But, not everyone is an intellectual. Not everyone is, so if the question is it, I mean, certainly Patanjali mandates it in the Kriya Yoga, svadhyaya, in the second word in the chapter, and it's also in the niyamas. So he places it as one of the elements of practice itself. But does one actually need to be philosophically sophisticated? Of course not. I mean, look at the Bhakti traditions of the gopis. They were illiterate. And in fact, most yogis in India historically, and including the ones you see wandering around today in the loincloths and the dreadlocks, most of them are actually literate. And certainly they would have been before the printing press in India. And so therefore they would be receiving the knowledge not so much through, remember, study would have been oral transmission. But if your question is, can one do yoga with absolutely no connection whatsoever? Of course one can. And one will get, the sadhana will work its own magic.
And at points, do you think study is actually counterproductive in the kind of further sort of separation of ego and,
Well, it doesn't have to be, because we could say that about anything. You could say that about Hatha Yoga. You become a virtuoso yogi and do all those fancy poses, then that can, so anything at all can become a source of ego. And so obviously learning it can make one proud, and one starts to become, the ego becomes, of course. But that goes with the ability to chant kirtan or the ability to do Hatha Yoga or anything at all. So that's just part of the work, is to always be on guard against those types of clashes.
What would that work look like, though? Because one can make kind of strong effort at things, but then inevitably kind of get hoisted by one's own petard. Kind of like by the effort itself, kind of entraps you. So how do you kind of keep on track with...
Yoga is a 24-hour kind of working in the mind. Just like when you do asana, you are working your body. If you're doing real asana, you're working every single muscle. In all of those poses, you are working. You're not just flopping into a pose. So in the same way, real yoga, which is mind, but yoga is taking place in the mind, whether it's Bhakti Yoga, where you're trying to keep your beloved Bhagavan in the mind, whether it's Jnana Yoga, where you're trying to keep the Upanishadic teachings in the mind, what to speak of Patanjali and Nirodha Yoga, where you have to keep the Nirodha Samskara controlling the mind. It is hard work. There is no magic wand. There is no, anyone that's is not having an experience of hard work is probably not doing real yoga. So there is no magic formula, and beware of anyone peddling magic formulas. Yoga is a state of constant mindfulness of one form of another, whether it's, again, a Nirodha mindfulness or a Jnana Yoga mindfulness or a Bhakti, keeping Bhagavan in the mind. It's work.
How would you, I know this sounds a really silly question probably to you. People often say to me, well, I've done it for a year or two, the yoga. It's not making me feel any happier. And I'm always a bit stumped because I never kind of assumed that yoga would necessarily make me immediately happy. How would you answer that?
Well, when they're talking about yoga, what are they talking about? Asana?
Yeah, they've been doing an asana practice. Maybe they've done a little bit of, reading, around or, little here and there,
I mean, it's, what can one say? I mean, surely this makes the body a better place to inhabit. If you're doing asana, then surely the body is feeling a little bit, it's a little bit less tight. It's a little bit, it's more relaxed, more stretched.
Sometimes they just feel a pain. It's kind of, when you stretch the body, then they kind of feel like, it's causing them suffering, the stretching, and, and every day doing it. And, they kind of think, well, I need to go back to normal life again. And, it's a bit more comfortable and ostensibly, seemingly happier. And it's a tough one to answer.
I think, yoga is for people that want to change. Yoga is triggered by suffering.
Right. You have to know that you're in suffering.
It's the first noble truth of Buddhism. And if you're not suffering, if you don't think you're suffering, then why would you take a yogic practice in the first place? But in fact, yoga, the definition of yoga is that which takes one beyond suffering. That's the definition in the Gita. Gita has 3 different definitions. One of them is takes you beyond suffering. Other traditions define it that way. So if one is not, if one's not being freed of suffering, then, the yogis would say they're not doing yoga. They're not doing proper yoga. They're at the mind, the mental attitude. Suffering's in the mind. So somehow there's something wrong with the attitude with which one is approaching yoga. One is expecting something that it's not designed to deliver. So, but proper yoga makes the mind sattvic, and one of the qualities of sattva is happiness. In the Gita, sattva has certain qualities like detachment, like we already mentioned one, interest in learning, interest in truth, but one of the primary qualities of sattva is happiness. And so if one is doing yoga, one is becoming a little bit, and to that little bit, one should be experiencing happiness. And if that's not happening, I don't know what you say. I would just say, well, then there's something wrong with the way you're doing yoga, or yoga's not for you. You don't need yoga. You're already happy. You already believe you are happy. Come back if you ever, if that belief ever leaves you.
Okay, so take it that they realize that there might be something to be improved. And often another question is, where do I start in the yoga text? And how do I start? I've often also had the conversation on Monday morning. I've read all of the Bhagavad Gita over the weekend, or all of the Yoga Sutras, and I'm kind of then left to say, okay, how was it? How do you start in referring to these texts, and which way and how would you start?
Well, obviously, if you're reading it, we did a workshop over the weekend. That's fair enough. We did a bunch of, but my intention is that is just to give people a glimpse at the Gita, and so that they develop some taste and they get something out of that, so that they can then go and study it themselves. But a real svajaya practice, you're not rushing through. It's not like reading a newspaper. You're just charging through it. That's a very rajasic way of studying. Just take 2 or 3 verses and read and then go deeply into them and contemplate them and examine them, apply logic to them. This is the Vedanta process. Shravanam, you hear, then manana, you reflect on it, and nididhyasana, you contemplate on them, and then you practice them. And part of that practice involves tapas, and there's no yoga without control, trying some kind of discipline and control of desires. That's not yoga if it doesn't involve that. And so therefore that can be hard. It's like if somebody's addicted to cigarettes. I remember when I was addicted to cigarettes as a kid, it was probably the hardest thing I had to do was break that habit. So that was suffering. So you could say in the beginning it's suffering, but you realize I'm suffering already deeply. Okay. And I go through this other sort of transitional period of suffering to break the patterns of the real suffering. And then you come to a plateau beyond. So that may also be the case. That yoga is challenging, physical yoga is challenging the way the muscles are used to being in the body. Mental yoga is challenging some of our views of life and desire and the rest of it. And so in the beginning, it can appear to be suffering. And the only reason to do it then is is recognize I want to change, and I'm ready to consider what the great sages and the saints for thousands of years, or 2-3 millennia, these not just in India but everywhere in the world, these mystical traditions are talking about this greener pasture on the other side of of embodied existence, and you're willing to consider, give that a chance, consider that as a goal to aspire, a reasonable goal to aspire for.
Mm. Mm. You can literally just pick up a text. You don't need any background, any further history of it, or anything like that. You do.
Well, in the Gita you can do that. Patanjali, when he writes the Yoga Sutras, he's assuming everybody has already read the more normative corpus of, like the Upanishads and the Vedas. Mm-hmm. But yes, you can. Mm. You'll struggle. You won't. But you just keep going. It's like asana. If you walk into the middle of an asana class, you can just join in. And you'll get something out of it. But if you keep doing it, then you'll start to see the connection between the poses. You'll start to, be familiar with the language. You'll start to really get some benefits. So, yes, you can start. It's a spiritual texts are spiritual. You can jump in anywhere. But yoga is about abhyasa, doing things in a regular daily way. And not frivolously. If one really wants to get benefits, there's no point just picking up a book for a couple of days and then moving on to something else. That's rajas. Right. So a constant, daily, repeated abhyasa, a repetitive study of just one or two texts. The Gita and the Yoga Sutras, that's fine. That's all you really need for a good long time.
I think that's very liberating to hear and very encouraging. I think for a lot of people who kind of feel overwhelmed by the text, how would you approach them? Obviously, you kind of want an open mind. Do you need to have faith in the text, or will they just render that to you?
They'll render that.
Right.
You have to have enough faith, or at least respect. You have to have enough sort of, at least, I would say, reasonableness to think, well, if something's been around this long, for 2,000 years, and accepted by the greatest intellectual minds of India, it must have something going for it. So that seems to be a reasonable starting premise. Mm-hmm. And then, but nothing more than that. I would advise people to bracket issues of belief and disbelief and, historicality and, sort of bracket scholasticism in a sense, not jettison it, but just let the text tell their own story in their own terms, say what they want to say, just allow those words to enter the mind and then work whatever effect they're going to work in the mind. Mm-hmm. It's like asana does to the body. You don't have to understand asana. If you follow a good teacher and you put pressure down on whatever it is on the inside of the foot, when whether you understand the sort of biology or the physics behind it or the physiology behind it, it will have an effect.
Right.
So same with Svadhyaya, and mantra is the same, and Ishvara Pranidhana, which Bhakti is the same.
This is an intriguing question, and I know it's probably not an easy one. What do you envisage the obstacles of a Westerner coming to these texts are? For the modern, can you kind of point out any kind of traps that we might kind of face in coming to these texts?
Well, I would say that, just off the top of my head, I can think of two distinct sorts of traps. The first is all of the texts are, every single one of them, Buddhist, Jain, all of the Hindu traditions, including right-handed Tantra, maybe left-handed is a different story. Every single one of them, however they may disagree, agree that desire is really the cause of our suffering and the cause of our bondage. That means desire for the body-mind satisfaction. Desire for the Atman is a different thing. And therefore, tapas and vairagya and these kinds of words denoting discipline are going to be stressed throughout. We just read the second chapter of the Gita. At the end of, around verse 50 or between 50 and 60, Arjuna says to Krishna, how do you identify a self, stitadhi, a self-realized soul, an enlightened soul? And then Krishna has 10, 12, 15 verses in answer, and every single verse he's saying the same thing in different words. He has to control desires, be free of desires. So growing up in a consumer culture, capitalism by its very nature, can only function by a capitalist economy needs to create desires where desires were not even there in the first place. So growing up in a consumer culture, our economy, our political systems encourage us to consume, success in life is the ability to have resources to consume. When we confront this opposing message that consumption is really what's our enemy, to use the language of Krishna, in the sense that it actually causes our suffering, that's a massive cognitive dissonance. That's a major block.
Yeah.
And the only way around that is to, at least, first of all, be provided that information that, according to moksha traditions, desire causes suffering, and then encourage people to be mindful of when they do engage in their desires, whether they really do satisfy or not. So that's the first block. And then I think, especially in England, there's the colonial, there is now with all of this sort of, with all the sort of, Black Lives Matter, now is a good moment to start breaking these sorts of attitudes down. But there is, and certainly when I went to school in England, a kind of a post-colonial racist bias against Indian culture. I mean, when I grew up, Indians were not, they were not seen as socially, they were sort of looked down upon in many instances, the 50s, 60s, 70s. All of that's changing, of course, now. And I haven't really lived in England for a very long time. But there may also be these kinds of attitudes, resistance to deities coming from the Abrahamic, the Old Testament. So these are kind of inherited Western cultural samskaras, kind of still lingering, sort of, unknown, and even good people, and like these this innocent, what do they call them, microaggressions, these kind of attitudes that still linger about Indian culture. So those are two possible sources of resistance, and I'm sure there's lots more. If we had time, we could talk about.
I guess you have to have kind of faith to believe that desire might not work in a way. So that's kind of an attitude of, you might have to have a little faith and try it.
Well, or even if you didn't, if you were willing to say, well, okay, why have these great thinkers, been saying this for 2,000 years? I don't have faith in it, but let me just observe.
Yeah.
That mindfulness is kind of an empirical practice. You start paying attention and you think, okay, maybe it's never occurred to you that what I think of as desire, actually, I'm always frustrated. I mean, it doesn't last. The desire doesn't last. I mean, I have my Kodak moment, but then it's gone, and then I'm thrust into a state of I've lost it, and then I have to do something else or repeat it, and start paying attention. I think that's the place to start. If one is just willing to consider this proposal, and one can just throw it away immediately and block it and say, oh, I'm not even going to, that's ridiculous. But if one is, has a little bit of wants to give some due diligence to Indian philosophy, then the place to start would be, okay, let me pay attention next time I go to the pub with my mates or whatever it is, and let me observe the whole evening, and then check in the whole time. Am I really? Is this the bliss I seek? Is this giving me the deep level of happiness that my heart really seeks?
Yeah.
Start being witnessing.
I think we also kind of lack a practical application of the text. It's like yoga and text and study is one thing, and then kind of what we do outside is another thing. But I've kind of a particular interest to make the text really practical, because when you read the Bhagavad Gita or some, or the sutras, you realise that there's nothing changed from that time to this time. That they're dealing with the very same issues.
Of course, I mean, because the mind is the mind. The culture may change, but the human mind and human consciousness, that doesn't change. And therefore, if you're providing information, if you're providing knowledge pertaining to that which doesn't change, the Atman, and also the mind. I mean, in some ways the mind is different. We have different ideologies and beliefs now, but the mind as a thinking entity, and especially the mind in its deep level, the klishta mind, the desires and aversions. The objects of desire may change, but the raw phenomenon of desire and the raw phenomenon of ego and the raw phenomenon of it, that doesn't change. And therefore, any knowledge system that addresses those deep level non-changing things is a perennial tradition. It's going to be universal. It's going to be applicable to all people at all times. And certainly any religion presents itself as that. Christianity, Buddhism, and certainly so does yoga.
Well, something like the Bhagavad Gita, is there the ability to kind of get lost in different interpretations? I mean, you translated the sutras, to my mind, beautifully. Is there different ways to read the same kind of sutra, or different ways to read the same
not the
stanza?
sutra, Not the sutra, because the commentarial tradition is quite consistent. The later commentators don't disagree with previous commentators. But that's a massive issue in the Bhagavad Gita tradition, because that's part of the Vedanta school of thought. And Vedanta differs massively between the non-dualists and the dualists and the, is the goal of life pure? Touching on just connecting to what we said before, is the goal of life pure consciousness, or is it an eternal relationship with God between two individuals? Now, that's a pretty major difference. Is the world real, or is it actually just a superimposition, a mirage? That's a pretty big difference. Is the soul an individual, or is it an infinite, omnipresent entity? That's a pretty big difference. And is Brahman ultimately impersonal, or is Brahman ultimately a personal being? That's a pretty big difference. So therefore, the Vedanta schools differ in the most essential metaphysical ingredients known to human thought.
And you find that difference in the Gita, but not in the sutras. But also in the sutras, it seems to be a possible reading an Advaita kind of perspective of the sutras, and also a dualistic perspective.
Not in the tradition, no. That may be modern day Advaitins are might want to appropriate it nowadays because it's become a canonical text. But there's no Advaita. Even Shankara, supposedly, scholars will quibble about whether it's the real Shankara or not, but he wrote a commentary, or someone under the name of Shankara. There's no Advaita in that at all. He's a dualist in that. Mm-hmm. And it's so remarkable that one scholar, Paul Hacker, says, well, this must have been Shankara before he became an Advaitin. So there is no Advaita in the pre-modern commentarial tradition. Now, if you're suggesting that modern commentators are Advaiticizing it, well, yes, and the Buddhists are Buddhicizing it, and even though the Yoga Sutras, rejects Buddhism in the 4th chapter. But yes, people nowadays are appropriating the sutras because it's become a commodified text. But if the question is in the tradition, there is pretty consistent. There's some small disagreements, but nothing of metaphysical significance. Dualistic. It's dualistic, pluralistic, realistic. Yes, not Advaita Vedanta.
So ultimately, the aim is to believe in God through reading the Yoga Sutras.
Well, the ultimate goal of yoga actually isn't that. Even though Ishvara Pranidhana is there, the ultimate goal of yoga is to experience of your own Svarupa, your nature of pure consciousness. Ishvara Pranidhana is there, but it's not the goal. In Bhakti, it's the goal.
Yeah.
But in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Ishvara is there because he's, you can use him as a prop for the mind. You fix the mind on the mantra, or, Om, on the Vachaka, and Ishvara can bestow Samadhi Siddhir, can bestow Samadhi on you. But that's not the goal, though. The ultimate goal of Patanjalian yoga is outlined right in the 3rd verse. What happens when you do Chitta Vritti Nirodha, Tata Kim Bhavati? What happens then? Drashtu Sarupe Vasthanam. The sea abides in its own nature, not abides in a loving relationship with God. That's bhakti. So the goal of bhakti is that love of God, for sure. And that's the goal in the Gita and in the Vaishnava traditions, in the Krishnamacharya tradition, and the Iyengar tradition. Not Pattabhi Jois. Pattabhi Jois was an Advaitin. So for him, the goal is infinite, impersonal, pure consciousness in Advaita.
That was a nice explanation. I'm not actually, for your information, I'm not actually this stupid. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
You're doing this. I understood this completely. You're doing this for your audience. Of course, I understand.
I'm trying to make you speak. I know a lot less than you, but I know a little bit.
You're not stupid at all. You're being very expert in getting me to say the things that you want your audience to hear.
Do you, obviously in the Bhagavad Gita, there's quite a lot of mention of food. My students, my readership is very interested in doing a very physical practice about diet. People are very concerned in the modern day about diet. It is the one choice we have on a consumer level, and how we put our money towards our diet affects greatly the impact on society, on animals, etc., etc. Do you have any recommendations on diet? And Krishna calls it the sacred digestive fire. It's right.
There's 3 verses in I can't remember the chapter. It's either 14 or 17, where Krishna is dealing with the 3 gunas, and so he speaks about the food in the mode of sattva, food in the mode of rajas, and food in the mode of tamas. So food in the mode of sattva is healthy, it's pure, it's obviously vegetarian. The prana, the words he uses, actually says snigdha, which means oily, which is a bit odd. But anyway,
right.
So that would be, it's fairly obvious, vegetables and plants. Rajasic food would be very spicy, anything very. So very salty, very sour, very spicy. Yeah. And that appeals to a Rajasic person who is always seeking stimulation. And it's the tamasic food that's rotten. That means meat, dead, it's rotten, it's putrid. And you may say, well, who was going to eat dead, dead, rotten, putrid in food? Well, meat eaters eat that because it's dead, it's rotten, it's only doesn't appear rotten because it's pumped full of chemicals. And that, of course, tamasic food causes injury to others and it causes injuries to oneself. It harms one's health, and it also creates karma. If we're eating a meat diet, then we have to take the karma of whatever that animal suffered. Then we have to take that our respective portion of that. So therefore, the tamasic food is destructive for the person. What to speak of the animal? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I just want so it's specific that we have to be vegetarian. To get the benefit.
That's just such an utter given.
Yeah,
it's a completely and utter given, vegetarianism. And of course, now the challenge we have to face that the ancient Indians didn't have to face is veganism, because they allowed the cows to roam. Yeah. And they just took the milk, and you have to take the milk from the cow because otherwise it suffers, and the calves can't drink all the milk. So it's like if you need to go to the toilet, your bladders are bursting. So there's nothing wrong with that. And of course, the Indian, and certainly the Krishna culture. I mean, the names of Krishna, Gopala, Govinda, that's the cow. But now, because of the way our cows are treated, we now have to face an issue that the ancient Indians didn't have to face. Like when I went to India, and still today, cows would live in the home. There would be a home, and they would have you'd enter in the home, there'd be a little hallway, and the cow would live there. And then it would go out in the day and wander about, and it'd come home for dinner at night. Literally, like, so lovely. Such a lovely thing. And now, of course, the cows in India are, they're still, no one's allowed to kill them, but now no one's looking after them either. And so they're wandering around in just an awful, bedraggled state, eating rubbish.
Yeah, they are, aren't they?
It really is bad.
And, yeah, absolutely.
But yes, so now we have to consider whether we, as yogis, we need to be vegans, because not that there's anything wrong with milk if it's sort of really the cow is not killed and if the cow is free roaming. But because of where our milk comes from, we now have to face a himsa issue. The ancient Indians didn't have to. We have to make that call. And it seems to me that, that call is that we should be vegan, not just vegetarian.
Right.
Yeah.
I hesitate to ask you this, just to wrap it up. But what, you don't have a TV, you're vegan. What do you do for fun, apart from study the? Do you have any indulgences?
I mean, I get thorough satisfaction from translating Sanskrit and reading Sanskrit texts and doing my pujas. And I hope that doesn't sound like I'm supposed to say that this is what I'm supposed to say kind of answer. But that just happens to be the truth of my reality. I mean, I go for bike rides if it's a nice day. I go for bike rides.
Just the music?
No, actually, I don't.
No,
I don't listen to any music. I'm very happy absorbing my mind in my social life is communing with the great sages in the form of the works that they left behind. I have friends everywhere. Before Corona, I would travel all over the place. So I had a very active life, and I'd be meeting people because they invite me. But I only go if they invite me to speak. I won't go just on a social. But obviously, you go to someone's studio, and then you spend the weekend, and then they'll take you to see places because they want you to, they want you to host you. So, but I don't seek any of that. Sometimes that happens. But now since Corona, I've been so content staying at home. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a yard. I have organic vegetables.
Oh, wow.
I have. So that's my.
That's not a yard. That's an acre of land.
I spend 2-3 hours a day out here.
That's incredible. Wow. And finally, what inspiration do you have apart from Krishna? Do you have any inspiration or figures of inspiration, whether literary or socially or politically?
Well, again, I'm probably going to sound very narrow-minded and myopic, and I'm actually quite happy to be, actually. The sages of ancient India, Vyas, I love them. I love all those texts. I Indian philosophy, all of the, the different schools, and, Gautama, Nyaya, all of that. I enjoy immersing my mind on that. In terms of politics, I'm not so involved anymore. I'm at the point where I guess I feel like the real deep level causes of our dysfunctionality in the world are spiritual.
Right.
And there needs to be political activism. There needs to be economic rebalancing of resources. Totally and utterly, all of that.
But it does, not just study of text.
Absolutely. No, but right. Let me finish what I was saying. There needs to be people who do these different things. There also needs to be people that dedicate their lives to propagating spirituality. Right. Now, there needs to be sages. There needs to be the teachers that go to that are operating on that level, the Atman level and the Bhagavan level. And so that's something that I'm trying to, that's a niche that I'm trying to fill. But obviously, there's all these other wonderful ways of serving, through political activism. Now is a great time for that, if one has that kind of energy and that kind of inspiration. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, that's good. That was a good question, actually. I kind of, almost by mistake, finally, the idea of renunciation and action, and that kind of plays out now. And kind of, should we just do yoga and, and do this stuff when the Rome is burning, or ought we to do something else apart from navel gazing, to kind of get people feeling bad about the contentment they have in their own practice? Should they get out and be more activistic, take a more kind of social and political engagement?
Yes, but if you do real yoga, you develop wisdom. Then if you go out into into the spheres of activism, you bring wisdom with you. Otherwise, you could just be running around and creating more disturbance. So yoga's contribution, what is the dharma of yoga? The dharma is the quintessential defining feature of a thing. Everything has a dharma. So, this bottle has a dharma. It holds fluid. So what is the dharma? What is distinctive about yoga that is not shared with other things? Okay, political activism has its dharma, that you're engaging the power structures of a society. And economic activism has its dharma. You're engaging the sort of economic resources and the distribution of those. And so everything has a dharma. So what's the dharma of yoga? When we use the term yoga, the dharma of yoga is that tradition, that body of traditions, which its quintessential defining feature is it's teaching people about their deepest, innermost self, where we are all equal. And if that information becomes available to, widespread in human being, that automatically reduces our isms, our racisms, our sexism, because yoga is teaching us that we're all essentially the same, and not just teaching us that theoretically, but providing methods that we can actually begin to start to experience that. So when we tap into the deep, the deeper practices of yoga, then we leave the studio, our vision has changed. We see beings differently. We see commonality. We see this person is me, I am him, I am her. And that's the contribution of yoga. Those that are really doing yoga. So we shouldn't feel like, oh, everybody else is acting and I'm doing my yoga. What's the relevance of that? And we should embrace the tradition and what it's saying about itself and what it claims to be offering. It's claiming to be offering the only real solution to suffering. It's taking us to this deep level place beyond suffering, beyond isms, beyond racisms and sexism, this deep level place of pure consciousness. And if we can introduce more of that into the world, then those who are yogis, who are really committed yogis, believe they're doing extremely important human welfare activity. And that's what the Buddha did. That's what Jesus Christ did. That's what these great acharyas, including Krishna, including Patabi Joyce, that was really at core how they understood themselves.
Wow. It's been such a pleasure on a personal level, and it definitely lived up to my hopes for the time with you. Wonderful. I'm lost for words. Can I just ask, can you let people know where they might find you?
Well, look, yes, I have a website, and I also have some stuff there that's downloadable for free. We're putting material up there. We do courses, and it's edwinbryant.org. And I have two links there. One is in academic videos, but, now we're teaching online. I'm putting all that up there. Course on the Vedanta Sutra, for example. And next semester, there'll be a course on Hindu philosophy. They'll be putting it up there week by week. But right now, we're in the middle of a 4-series course on the history of yoga. We just did one part, and you can register for that on my website under the other link, which is yoga philosophy for practitioners. And you can register there, and it's by donation or free if you don't have resources. Okay, so edwinbryant.org. And then there's a workshop schedule there, but the workshops will charge. That's the studio. But my own stuff is all free on the website. Thank you, Adam, very much for your interest and for reaching out and for the work that you're doing.
That was amazing. Thank you.
See, this is what you're doing. This is what yogis are supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be. This is our dharma. Our dharma is to try to make this information available to whatever communities Ishvara has given us, and whichever ways. And you're a radio host, and that's the way you've adopted. And you're reaching out, and you're making these teachings and available to people. So you are actually doing what a yogi is supposed to be doing in terms of philanthropy and activism and welfare work. So I thank you for that.
I thank you. Thank you.